Hello, dear listeners. I'm pleased to introduce today's episode on Michael Chabon's great American novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. The book is an alternative history novel about the comic book industry, escape artists, identity, and the friction between commerce and art. It follows the lives of two Jewish cousins as they invent an incredibly successful comic book hero, the Escapist. The book charts their history in parallel with their comic book hero over the golden age of the comic book industry. Along the way, we meet surrealists, pulp writers, failed terrorists, and other assorted characters, both real and imagined. We're joined today by Nat from the excellent Collective Action Comics podcast, who was an ideal third mic on this episode. His historical knowledge of the comic book industry and general readiness to read a 600-page literary fiction book was much appreciated. We decided to cut this episode into two, given the length, and with that in mind, we hope you enjoy part one of this conversation.
Welcome back to the Infinite Library, ladies and gentlemen. We're back. We're back on our Chabon series. Ben and I are here as always, but we're reading The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And for a book this hefty, we decided we needed to call in some backup. So we have a two-fisted team up for you tonight. That's right. We have the wonderful Nat of Collective Action Comics here joining us to talk about this novel. Nat, how are you doing?
Doing all right. How's everybody?
Can't complain. Just finished up reading this 600-something page novel. So.
Yeah. Wow. It was a hefty bugger for sure. I think the way that I had planned to intro my impression of the book was as follows. I would describe this to anybody who asked me, and I assume people are going to be lining up at my front door to ask me. I would describe this book in two words: relentlessly indulgent.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't disagree with that at all.
I thought it was the prose is very good, if a bit flowery, but I think some of that comes from the fact that he was doing an imitation of the pulps, and a very good one. But I think that if you were to just automatically and without any prior investigation take out every single second sentence, like every other sentence in the book, it would be 300 pages and you'd get the same story.
In this book, Chabon's perfectly into the, like, what I told John is the bravura paragraph, where he's describing something and then he just can't help himself and he starts like spinning a bunch of plates for like an entire paragraph, much like the illusionists that they talk about in this. And I think that's like a perfect description. I also think that like John and I have kind of been tracking Chabon's interest in like merging pulp with like, you know, we could say like highbrow literature so that it becomes somewhat like middlebrow. And I think he does an interesting job of like sequestering his pulp fixations to like their own chapters. Whereas like we had started from the beginning, he'll like describe like a social phenomenon in terms of like a sci-fi trope, or he'll describe like something common in sort of a pulpy way. And here, like, it's all kind of contained to its own thing, which like you were saying, you could also sometimes remove those and like you wouldn't really miss that much. Like, sure, it's the plot of The Escapist, but like it's like the pulp set piece kind of. Yeah. So that makes total sense to me.
There was a moment there in one of them, and I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, that I thought he pulled such a great illusion where it started off like a pulp thing and it became real life, and you don't know where that, there's one specific sentence where it's like, oh, wait a minute. He's not talking about a comic book, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yes. I actually really like that chapter and that turn in particular. You know, what I think with this book, Matt, I agree with you 100%. This is like very much kind of, I think, the point where Chabon was kind of handed like a blank check by his publisher. And they were like, you know what? Those first two sold great. Go nuts, kid. And he took that and ran with it for better or worse.
Yeah. It feels like there was no one there to say no to him.
Yeah. Which I can kind of appreciate that. I sometimes think that, I mean, Chabon is kind of like an MFA writer of like an earlier age where there was a much higher emphasis on like craft and kind of like constructing like a beautiful sentence in a way where I feel like people coming out of MFA programs now are taught to be a lot more economical and like straightforward. And so I can kind of appreciate just someone who's really been taught and who really knows how to like just, craft like a really bravura sentence or paragraph, being given the space to do that, even if it maybe ends up being very pillowy as a result.
Especially since,
a good word for it.
Yeah, pillowy, definitely. Especially since, in like, I've talked about this in a previous episode, he tried to write the Great American Novel as his second novel, and it was a failure. It was something like 2,000 pages. He shipwrecked it. It exists in an edition of McSweeney's that I do not want to pay money for. So if anyone's listening to this and has the sample of what's known as Fountain City, his abandoned novel that he wrote before this one, please send it to me because I want to read it. But I think it's interesting that he finally like nailed it this time, and like he does so by like having more of a historical focus and by talking about like comic books and pulp writing and also magic tricks. Like even just describing it that way, like you can already tell it's indulgent. There's at least like three things going on. So yeah, the magic tricks, the pulp writing, and the comic books, most importantly the comic books, but it contains like those other two, and those are like at least all given plenty of word space, as it were. So
I think
go ahead, Nat.
Oh, I was going to say, I think what sort of saves this all for me, again, I liked the book. I wish there had been less of it. But what sort of saves it for me is you can tell just how much he loves comic books.
Yeah.
As much as he's trying to merge pulp and comic roots with a highfalutenness of society, if you will, you can tell that he doesn't feel like he's slumming it.
Yeah. You know, Nat, I think that's a great point. I think that's why Ben and I have kind of gravitated towards Chabon as like an interesting person to talk about, because he is so shameless in terms of liking like pulpy or like lowbrow writing, but also really clearly loves, highbrow or even like middlebrow fiction too. He's one of those guys you can tell he reads like everything and like likes a lot of different kinds of fiction. And so I think his books kind of always end up being these very like chimeric things where he's trying to blend all these things he likes together. And I think they really can kind of live or die based on how much he likes those things. Maybe I agree. Like, I think that the love he clearly really loves comic books. He's clearly very interested in the history of comics and kind of the way that they've developed as an art form. And I like some of my favorite parts of this book are just the parts where he kind of goes almost into like exposition mode, and he'll like describe the physical process of like a comic being printed on like these lithograph machines, or he'll like just talk about the ways that like comic books are changing over like a 2 or 3 year period and like getting more literary or getting sillier. And, this is not like a book where it's like somebody was like, oh, I need to write like a novel about American history. And they just like pick a topic out of a hat, which this is definitely like kind of a boomer novel in the fact that it's like about World War II and all that. But
that's also something I want to talk about, is how like the long shadow of World War II and the fact that this like came out in the year 2000, which we don't have to get into now. But I think it's interesting that like that's such a big part of this book. So yeah. I have a feeling this is going to be a long, meaty episode.
I mean, if we were to get started on just the plot, right? It's so interesting that it's not exactly novel, but it is a good way to start, where he talks about like at the end of their lives, right? Basically when they're old men and they're at WonderCon. which, you know, as soon as he brings up WonderCon, a relatively unknown comic book convention, especially back in 2000, that he is hammering you in the face with the fact that this really happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, that this is real, damn it.
And the sort of voice of the charming narrator, like John, you had mentioned the sort of documentary style, but like there are footnotes where the narrator is like, oh, by the way, like, and it usually ties into like something like historically true. Like there's a bit where like Joseph might threaten the painter Max Ernst at like a surrealist party. Like that's the kind of like, yeah, this really happened. Like it's sort of like pseudo history or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it gives the game away right at the beginning. Right at the beginning, when that narrator talks about Sammy Clay at WonderCon extolling the virtues of stepping into a telephone booth and coming out a different person.
Yeah.
And that sets up the entire, I think, point of the novel, or point of contention of the novel, rather, is did these people step into their own phone booths?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's up for interpretation, obviously, but we'll get to what everybody thinks, I think, at the end, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a novel about identity and about, you know, concealing and defending against like the real self, or is there a real self? You know, the classic question, you know, who is Superman the real person, or is Clark Kent the real person?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's there is a right answer to that question.
Well,
but
there's two right
you can
answers.
argue about it.
There's two right answers, and the fact that they are in complete contention or opposition to each other is fodder for hours of debate.
Yeah.
That's why we brought you on, Nat. You are the expert on Superman at the very least.
Well, it's like that old Mitchell and Webb bit where it says they ask some game show contestant, they say, "Is there a God?" And the person says, there's no answer to that. And the game show host says, "I can think of two answers off the top of my head."
Yeah, the agnostic dilemma. Yeah, it's like I don't know, but yeah.
All right, so I guess to start off, we should introduce kind of our main characters, the titular Cavalier and Clay, because I think that, like you said, Nat, there's definitely all these characters feel like self-inserts to some degree, but these two are very obviously the most self-insert that I think we see in the book. And I think it's really interesting in the light of kind of what we've read of Chabon so far, where it's very clearly him trying to like divide up different parts of his personality into like two guys. Yeah. In a way that his kind of previous protagonists have both felt just like him at like different points in his life. This feels like something a lot more, I don't want to say artful, because I don't know if it's that, but it's definitely kind of, this is a book being written by someone who's trying to like sort out his identity as much as any of the characters are. At least that's my contention. So we have the titular Cavalier and Clay. So that's Joseph Cavalier, or Joseph, maybe. I guess it would be the German pronunciation. And then
but
Sammy
they call
Clay.
him Joe. They call him Joe.
Yeah,
that's true. That's true.
He's like, call me Joe, insists upon that. Like he's taking on like his shortened American form, and he's like, fine, I guess. Yeah, because he's from Prague. So yeah.
Yeah. So Joseph or Joe Cavalier, Prague-born Jewish man, or I guess boy at the start of the novel, who learns to be like an escape artist through kind of a contrived series of encounters as a child with like street magicians, basically.
Yeah, Kornblum is his mentor. Yeah.
I would like to put just a caveat here for the listeners. Everything that we're about to describe actually happens in the book. We're not making this up.
No, not a word. It's all.
So please believe us when we tell you these ridiculous things.
Yeah, because he's trained by a street magician because he wants to be an escape artist. He tries to do like a Houdini-esque escape in like the middle of the river, and his brother helps him, at which point they almost drown, and his magician mentor, or his illusionist mentor, has to save him from the river, which is sort of like one of the inciting incidents of Joseph's story.
Yes, and basically it's Prague in like the late 1930s. So some bad things are happening in the background, which we'll talk about. And so he manages to. So first they steal the Golem of Prague.
Yes, they steal the Golem of Prague, as Nat said. That did happen. We're not riffing. Yeah. So yeah, in order to prevent bad things from happening, I must first steal the Golem of Prague. Yeah. So.
I read this book when I was in high school, and I don't know how I managed to forget that happens like in the first 100 pages of this book. And I remember like reading through that chapter and being like, how did I forget this? This is the most ridiculous thing I think I've ever read happen in like the first leg of a novel.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to point out too that Tommy Cavalier, Joseph's younger brother, is the first of two children in this book who have and are motivated by unbelievably adult understandings of the world.
Yeah.
Like they should not have these insights. This child is like 4 years old, or like 5 or 6 or 7. I don't remember how old. I don't, because he was 13 and Joe was what, 21 or something.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But then, because he said because of the rescue that his brother had to attempt in the river, it like ruined his brother's potential musical career. And I'm like, the kid is 5. Because it's like he gets deaf in one ear or something like that.
Yeah, and he was
like,
yeah.
The Cavaliers are definitely like, I think I described it to Ben when we were talking about this a little bit before recording. They're like a Royal Tenenbaums type family where they're all like brilliant, like psychiatrists and doctors and artists and stuff. And so he forecloses on his brother's chance to meet his Tenenbaum-ian destiny.
Oh, what a story that could have been.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Nat, because I didn't quite think about that. But now that you've mentioned it is kind of clicking things a little more into place for me. And I feel like, again, that's kind of the boomeriness of this novel coming through, where it's this almost like idealization of like these greatest generation, or quote unquote, like greatest generation-y type people, where it's like, oh, well, this kid, like he's having to grow up in like under these like such tough circumstances. Like, of course, he's going to be more mature and like more serious than we are today.
Yeah. But it's and to Chabon's credit, I was thinking about something like that while reading it. And I was thinking, well, this is such a lionization of the trials and tribulations of these children, but so much of that is afforded to white children or European children rather than, children of color and stuff like that. But to Chabon's credit, he's obviously like very pro-Palestine and stuff like that. His wife, did you know she got arrested trying to sneak aid into Gaza?
Yeah, no, it's actually very inspiring. Before I pitched this to Ben, I was kind of like, I was like Googling to see like, Chabon is obviously like a very Jewish author. And I was like, I really hope that like this author I liked when I was in high school didn't turn out to be like a huge crank. And then it's like, you find out that actually, no, he and his wife are very involved and like very vocally pro-Palestine, which is, I don't want to like essentialize like, like a Jewish author has like an obligation to be as vocal as possible, but the fact that he clearly has been is very, very cool.
Yeah, I would say it's not
everyone in America does. Honestly,
it's not that he's a Jewish author that gives him that responsibility. It's that he's a fucking best-selling author that gives him that responsibility.
Yeah, I think also just like I'm sure we've all had like writers we liked not cover themselves in glory in the last year, to say the least.
Yeah.
So somebody that I like not at least being very vocally good in a year where a lot of people have at best been quiet. It's been cool to see.
And I also think you can kind of see, if not like that specific political engagement, just with the idea of there being like different kinds of Jewish identity. Like early on, Joseph meets the magician character who's described as being like an Eastern Jewish person who like speaks differently, has different customs. And like Joseph is sort of like, oh, like, you know, there's more kinds of people that are both like me, but not like me, as opposed to being like this sort of like hegemonic block. And I think like that kind of goes throughout the book where like at one point, like Sammy decides to keep, you know, not eating meat, whereas Joseph doesn't. And there's sort of like a kind of ongoing kind of like interrogation of that, as opposed to, you know, something that might be more just like, it's only this kind of person that's allowed to do this. So, and I think that kind of is like, I think that's just him kind of understanding what it means. It's like part of the identity he wants to write about. So,
yeah, especially because the fact that he describes himself as an atheist, and like Joe and Sammy end up writing the great Jewish graphic novel. And neither of them are practicing. And Joe himself is explicitly not a believer. I don't remember about Sammy.
I get the impression that Sammy is also not a believer, but in kind of like a less conscious way, where he's kind of got the American thing where, you know, it's not important to him at all. It's not like a thing he's ever consciously had to like reject or think about in a way that I feel like Americans in like certain enclaves can manage that.
Yeah.
Speaking of Sammy.
Yeah, we should get to Sammy. So yeah.
No, it's okay. So yeah, Joseph steals the golden Prague and manages to get smuggled out of Czechoslovakia or whatever it was at the time. I honestly don't remember.
Pees himself while doing so.
Yes. And goes to New York City to live via
Lithuania, then Japan.
Yeah.
That was kind of crazy, actually.
Yeah, that's specific. Yeah, like it makes a point of noting that, like he had to go to Japan and then like somewhere else and then to New York. Yeah,
but we never hear about that part.
Yeah,
it just gets mentioned, and the one thing is like they're like, "Where did you learn your English?" He's like, "I don't want to talk about it," and that's it. We don't know where he learned his English.
Yeah,
but gets to New York and lands with his cousin Sam, who is a good old New York Jewish boy living in, you know, a tenement apartment, classic New York type story, with his mother.
Ma.
There's a great description of how her cooking is so bad that when he eats it, it's like the same as like folding wet laundry and like shoving ashes into its mouth, as well as swallowing a secret map, which I think is like, that's like a perfect Chabon description. It's like sort of like eating horrible food is like you're swallowing a secret map, like you're some sort of like treasure hunter under capture or something like that. So
the man has a flair for the dramatic, that is for certain.
Yeah, he does. So that kind of gets us into the first leg of this book, which is really kind of exploring the development of these two as like a pair, as artists.
Yeah.
I guess there's one other interesting thing to mention about Sam that I feel is very relevant to kind of his character as it develops. That's that his dad is a traveling vaudeville performer who's like
the Mighty Molecule.
The Mighty Molecule.
Whose whole thing, which is this was a thing that people just went to go see at like the circus back in the day, I guess. A very muscular man who was like below like 5'5".
Yeah, unbelievably muscular for the time. Yeah.
And like we can all imagine the like horizontally striped red and white bathing suit.
Oh yeah,
that this man is in or has modified slightly.
One hand lifting
his muscles.
The barbell with the two big balls on the end that say 100 lbs.
Yeah, with his handlebar mustache extending beyond his ears.
I also like that he only eats like vegetables, and his wife, Sammy's mother, like hates this. Like she's like, you're eating whatever you want when you're not here. Like you're not actually eating only vegetables.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's something I actually thought was really interesting. So he has like a comic book backstory.
Yeah,
and it's that he like learned secret like stoic like meditation techniques and like eats like a Pythagorean diet, which I guess is what what people had to say that's where they were getting all their secret wisdom from before they managed
Hush,
to
boy,
translate.
I'm trying to listen to the music of the spheres.
Yeah, before they translated the Bhagavad Gita into English, that's what cranks had to say they were doing.
That's so funny.
And like, no, you go ahead, Nat.
Oh, I was just saying, there's a formative moment there in Sammy's life when he's at like penis height to his dad and like recognizes that he's been staring at his father's penis for a little bit. And then I thought that was just in there for no reason until about 1,000 pages later.
Well, that's the thing with Chabon that I've realized as, again, coming back to him as an adult, there's like a lot of stuff that went totally over my head when I was a kid. And that's that he is a huge Freudian.
Yeah.
And I think that actually it comes out more strongly in this book than any of the other ones we've read. There's a lot of kind of like little, not even quite gags, but, like Yosef's mother is working on like a book or an essay called The Reinterpretation of Dreams.
Yeah. And there's a Freud reference in his first book as well that we talked about. When he's like, there's like weird stuff with the dad in the first book, and he's like writing a paper on Freud and noses. It's like the first scene of the main character in Mysteries of Pittsburgh. So yeah, clearly like a theme for Chabon.
Yeah, but I think that like this book is very much about like basically like creativity as like a defense mechanism in like the Freudian sense, I think. And I think this is very much kind of what's happening with Sam, where, yeah, he sees his dad's dick and then his dad runs away and gets, doesn't he like get squished by like a big rock or something?
Yeah, there's some horrible accident that he's like crushed, I think. Yeah.
That. There's so much that happens and so much that doesn't happen in this book. I had forgotten that his dad got squished by a big rock.
It's what a way to go out for a strong man, I guess. Yeah.
If only they had written 100 lb on it, he could have lifted it.
Yeah, just above the head. Yeah.
Just one-handed.
Yeah.
But
Looney Tunes logic in there.
But yeah, I really liked the bit with his dad because it's just this kind of like it's kind of like the Golden Frog thing where it's this absurd sketch that's thrown into this book, and almost like leaves the plane of believability for a brief moment before kind of reality reasserts itself a little bit, which. I don't know. Ben, you said earlier you thought like all the pulp stuff kind of got contained, kind of do their own chapters. And I think that's true to some degree, but there is kind of always this weird, it never quite reaches like magical realist levels, but there are definitely chapters where even reality gets like more picaresque than others.
Yeah, and I think like, and as you were describing it, it's like, yeah, these are sort of ludicrous starts in a sense of like straining believability. But I think it's also interesting that like, yeah, in terms of like Chabon saying like we have art experiences to kind of escape our lives. It's interesting that they already start with such colorful lives to begin with. Like they're not exactly like humdrum, like they're kind of humdrum characters, but like they already have kind of like inciting incidents that like, beggar the mind, and then they get into comic books basically. So yeah, maybe it does kind of, it's not just contained, but I think in terms of like sentence style, maybe that's it. Like when it's directly copying the style that's like in the chapter.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. I'd like to point out to the listeners at home that all of this that we've been talking about right now has been presented to us bookended with the fact that Sammy and Joe are still in bed together.
Yeah.
Because Joe has just arrived in America and they don't have like a couch or anything for him to sleep on. So he just sleeps in his cousin's bed with his cousin. And then I think right at the end of that, they go out for a cigarette on the fire escape, right?
Yeah.
And
and Joe says that he'll smoke the cigarette butts if they don't have any like whole ones left.
Yeah, and they create a full cigarette.
This guy's cool.
Yeah. They create a full cigarette, and it's like, Joseph can like wrap it just dexterously. Like, and Sammy's like, wow, this guy knows what he's doing. Like, so
as we'll see, he's going to be a hit at parties. So
it felt very true to kind of a youthful experience of like, you kind of get introduced to someone who's like a friend of a friend or like a distant relation. And it's like, oh man, who's this guy? And then they're able to do like one cool thing and you're like, okay,
All
I'm
right,
here.
yeah.
I'm here for this.
And then
You
that
said you're
they
my
re-
cousin.
Yeah, and they repeat that later when he does like an acrobatic trick to get on the fire escape. And there's a moment where like Sam sees him and he's like, "Man, I wish I was that cool. Like I wish I was him." And that's kind of like that gets channeled into the creation of the Escapist, the comic book, in the idea of like a guy who can do anything and that you want to be him. And like this sort of the reoccurring thing where it's like, man, I wish the Escapist was real. And then like, yeah, later, like 1,000 pages later, somebody's like, he's not real, right? Like, because they were like way too into the idea of this guy being real. So yeah, like I think that kind of coolness and that kind of like being heroic for other people is like a real strong undercurrent for like art creation, at least in this book.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that Sammy is the one cast as being the like creative writer, the teller of these tales, when he himself is, racked by polio, can't do the things that he writes about, but is in such close proximity to somebody who basically can.
Yeah. No, I think like that's one thing that I do think I like about Chabon's writing is, like you said, these are all kind of self-inserts, but it feels like it's this interesting thing where I feel like he is like psychoanalyzing himself to some degree. And it's kind of this thing where he's developing these imagos who like in their relations, you can see like the relations that I feel like Chabon has like inside himself in terms of like his relationship to like being Jewish or his relationship to like kind of not being like ideally masculine or like this kind of bisexuality as a theme that runs through his work. And yeah, I like that. I feel like there's something that is at least interesting about just watching someone like try to get to grips with their own psyche in that way.
It definitely seems more vulnerable than I'm one to think for the kind of like best-selling midwit author where it's just like here it's like I have all of the answers. And I think like Chabon's very interested in sort of dissecting parts of himself in a way that I think is like more vulnerable than somebody who's just gonna say like comic books are actually good, like which would be like one way this like could have gone this kind of story. So
yeah. So one scene I liked and I wanted to get you guys' opinion on, I feel like it's kind of the core of this part of the book, this like first section. I really kind of like the bits where they're kind of getting their group together and they're kind of planning out this idea of a comic book. So at the start, Sam is kind of like, he's doing basically like odd jobs for like a pulp magazine like shop basically,
and they sell gags.
It's a gag shop. It's a gag shop that has a magazine of their wares.
Yes, but they like write like pulp adventure stories like in it, basically just to for volume, basically.
It'll fill the space.
And they basically like they're able to like go to their boss and be like, "Hey, have you heard about these new falutin things called comic books?" And they're able to talk them into letting them publish them. And I really like the scene of them just kind of working together and like creatively collaborating and kind of creating what's going to go on to be this really huge thing. I kind of liked the way this book like looks at creativity as just like a process and like a collaborative process, especially. I feel like it's very easy, especially with writing, to kind of get into this headspace of like, oh, creativity is like a solitary act.
Yeah, the genius working alone. Yeah.
Whereas this book, I feel like it's very clear, and maybe it's like something about comic books where they require, like, there are very few people who do like all the writing and all the artwork on comic books, especially like at this level.
Especially superhero comics.
Yeah. And kind of just like the process of like creative collaboration, I think was, I don't have anything deep to say about it. I just really liked that part of the book.
Yeah, it's cool. And I think later, and we'll get to this, but when we find that Joe has been working on something by himself for like 9 years in an office building that he's also sleeping in, he has a script written. but very deliberately, none of it is in the comic yet.
Yeah.
And it takes Sammy's influence to sort of push him into that. I think maybe unconsciously, but it still speaks volumes about that collaborative effort. And the fact that so many of the immediate and the lasting relationships in this book are formed because of that collaborative effort, I think also concretizes that.
Yeah, and also too, I feel like most of the art that's talked about in this book is like in dialogue with something. And I think like you get that from comic books. I think Chabon probably got that from all the interviews he did with like some of the great comic book writers that he thanks in the credits. Like, I think it's all very dialogue driven. Joseph's stuff evolves with his girlfriend's interest in surrealism. They create the escapist by talking, and then the narrator points out that you create a golem by talking. So I think like that's like a very important part for him in terms of like the collaborative aspect of making art, where it's not solitary genius. It's not sort of, I can't remember. I think the phrase in Don Quixote refers to his book as the son of his brain. It's like not just the son of one person's brain. It's like several. It takes several people to raise a child, So,
that's right.
And I think that seems like important to Chabon that we understand this, at least for the story about art that he wants, to tell.
Yeah. And I think too, talking about comic books and, his research that he did and interviewing all these people and stuff like that, it speaks to that where, and I didn't expect this at all. I didn't expect him to just put this little fact in there, but when he says that these magazines that like this gag company makes, right, or other comic book companies, pulp production houses, they have to have a certain number of words in them so they get special mailing rates.
Oh, well, yeah.
Be considered as magazines. So if you actually go back and read old Superman, I'm talking old Superman, like Superman #1, right? Mm-hmm. They actually have prose short stories of Superman in them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like that were obviously just farted out overnight, right? Like, and some of them are great. Like one of them is him just pulling one over on the same cop over and over. It's great. But that's why there's letters columns in older books too, because that counts for the word count.
Nice. Huh.
That was like a 50s invention on, I don't know if it was Mort Weisinger, the like notoriously curmudgeonly Superman editor who had that idea, but it was somebody's idea in his orbit. So it shows that Michael Chabon knows and cares about comics.
Yeah. No, and one thing I also really liked in this book is I feel like it kind of dovetails with this is, again, there's kind of this moment of really beautiful like collaboration between like all these like young friends, like very much playing around and like just bouncing ideas off each other and kind of letting things develop in this very playful way that, again, like I found very moving as someone who tries to do creative work with other people. But then they take it to their boss and they immediately get fucked over.
Yeah. Which is exactly what happened to Siegel and Schuster, basically. Like, yeah. They sold Superman for $130.
Wow.
Yeah. And it really just shows like the way that there is like this element in this book where it is very clearly a little queasy about like the business side of these things. And I have no idea like about like what Chabon's like rates were when he was writing this or like his previous books. But I don't know, there is always this tension whenever you're writing or you're doing any kind of creative work where obviously like it is ideal to be able to make some kind of money off of it. There's a great bit at the beginning where Sam has lied to his friends about how much money they're going to make. Yeah, he's going to be able to get them $8 a page, and they can only get $5.
Also, the editor says, "I wouldn't pay $8 to John Steinbeck," which is a great like period specific line. But anyway, yeah. So,
but yeah, it just this kind of thing where it's like this is like a thing you were doing kind of out of love and joy and for pleasure, and maybe you want to make money off of it, but then there's always this apparatus that's then trying to figure out, well, how do I make more money out of it? How do I take it from you and make even more money out of it?
Yeah. So I guess like to catch everybody up to speed. At this point, Joe Cavalier has learned how to be an escape artist. He's come over to the United States, specifically because he wanted to get out of Czechoslovakia to escape the Nazis and make enough money to bring his family over here. And in the process was also bringing over the Golem of Prague. But and now he has discovered, or Sammy has discovered, that he can draw, that Joe can draw. So he's got these stories and he works at this gag place. And they assemble a stable of writers, like just kids in the neighborhood who are writing like pirate comics and funny animal comics and stuff like that. And then they bring their idea for somebody or for what was it? The Golem, right? They show him the Golem
initially.
Yeah. For a superhero, and it gets rejected. And then because of Joe's experiences as an escape artist, Sammy comes up with the idea of an escapist. And he thinks about it like this because Joe literally just dives into a room with a naked girl in it.
Yeah, by doing a trick on the fire escape as well, which is where he sees him. Yeah.
And again, I want to impress upon the audience that we're not making any of this up when I tell you that this girl's name is Rosa Luxemburg.
John was like, "There's no way I would have got that when I read it as a child."
I was like, that is like a deep cut for like, red diaper baby, like Jewish people in New York.
Some like old upstate socialists.
Yeah, I know.
There's also not long after that, a guy asked Joe to draw the naked woman, and Joe draws the naked woman, and the kid goes, "I can't see anything." He's like, "You didn't pay me enough," like, or something
which is very funny because when there were some of the very first when they were pitched in some of the very first legal battles for Superman, Siegel and Schuster were basically just off the docket, right? Siegel went and tried to do a bunch of freelance work, and Schuster started drawing for other publications, specifically other kinds of publications, specifically pornographic kinds of publications. And he would just draw not Clark Kent and not Lois Lane in these like dominatrix scenes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So that even sort of applies in that. Yeah. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so obviously this naked girl runs out, and I think, is it only Sammy that sees her butt?
Oh man, I can't remember. Or was it
Joe? I mean, Joe saw it obviously when he was like in the room, but she like drapes herself in a jacket and runs away, leaving her purse on the nightstand.
I don't recall, honestly.
And I just want to impress again, we're not making this up when we tell you that Rosa Luxemburg will come back and be introduced in the most ridiculous fucking scene in the entire book.
Yeah, because also like Joe works really hard, and then he's just like, "Yeah, I'd like to see that Rosa lady again," and then nothing really happens, and then the most ridiculous scene happens where she's reintroduced. So,
but
they come up with the idea of the escapist, and it gets purchased. From them, and
specifically they're told after they're like, "We want to make a comic book about the Golem of Prague." They're like, their boss is basically like, "Bring me a Superman."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You heard of this Superman guy? Bring me one of them.
And that's a scene I should have clocked as important. And then as soon as they brought it up again, I was like, oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
This is just what happened in real life.
Because just a quick dip ahead. Later, Sammy has to perjure himself and swear that he was not asked to produce a Superman because they're under threat of getting sued for copyright infringement.
Yeah, which national publications did. That's how they got Captain Marvel.
Damn. Yeah.
Or rather Shazam now, because they've been fed a taste of their own medicine.
Nat, I don't know how much I know. Again, you've obviously done a lot of reading on like Superman and stuff. How did this feel to you as kind of like a depiction of like these kind of early years of comic books in terms of just kind of like the ways that I feel like this book kind of shows how it's like developing out of kind of all these different strains of stuff. If you feel, like you can speak on that.
So let me answer your question with a question.
Okay.
All those ridiculous stories about people organizing to commit smash and grab robberies at like Walgreens and CVS that's like actually not happening, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, imagine that, but it's people breaking into a store of imaginary superpowered beings and grabbing as many ideas off the shelves as they can and just seeing what sticks with what once they get home, right? That is what happened in the early days of superhero comics. Everybody who could pick up a pencil and draw a cape did so, and they had the most ridiculous ideas. They had the most inane ideas to the most imaginative, right? And the best ones stuck, and the worst ones, no one can name them anymore, right?
Yeah.
And I think that this book did a pretty good job of capturing stuff like that. We didn't get any kind of listicles or anything about it, but the fact that we kept hearing about other younger guys in Sammy's and Joe's orbit also working on this stuff, I think is a testament to the fury of creation that was happening at that time.
Yeah, I'm not going to read this whole bit, but there's a great line that I flagged around what you're just talking about, where he talks about how like it was a period of like creativity. So as with all mongrel art forms and pigeon languages, there was in the beginning a necessary, highly fertile period of genetic and grammatical confusion. Men who had been reading newspaper comic strips and pulp magazines for most of their lives, many of them young and inexperienced with the pencil, the ink brush, and the cruel time constraints of piecework, struggled to see beyond the strict spatial requirements of the newspaper strip, on the other hand, and the sheer overheated wordiness of the pulp on the other. So, yeah, just the highly fertile period of, just like smash and grab. That's also why they spend a lot of time discussing the why, because apparently they were just characters that can freeze things, characters that can light things on fire. And Sammy or Joe, I can't remember, keep asking, but why? Why does he want to do that? And like they spend a lot of time obsessing about that until they get to the idea of the escapist.
Yeah. So I think it did a fairly good job of that without letting it get in the way of the story of these two guys.
Yeah. I almost feel like if there's kind of a weakness in how it maybe is doing like the faux history here along the lines of the comic books, I feel like they kind of he keeps coming back to the idea that like Joe and Sammy are like the first people to be like, well, what if we like weren't stupid about this?
Yeah.
Like what if we thought about like the character having a backstory that made sense, or like what if we drew in like literary references and like tried to make it good?
Well,
that's a great point.
I'm glad you bring that up, because the why thing. So, being a writing instructor, a lot of the time you have to tell an undergrad, but why? Why are you telling me about this? Like, because a lot of them just think they can tell you about something and that's like good enough. And also I think that kind of applies to just like writing a story at all. So like when they say why, it almost, John, feels like Chabon asking himself, why am I writing this book? And so like in a way, like they're the smart ones because they're some aspect of Chabon who knows what he's doing. Like they're a little like they're like ahead of the curve just enough to make this happen. They know to ask why, like that kind of stuff. So
yeah, I do think that given the description of Joe's later early work with Luna Moth, which we'll get to, that felt like it was something that we wouldn't really see in comics till decades later.
I actually wanted to ask you about that. Real briefly, they talk about like the use of surrealist art techniques on Joe's like collage, having weird lines and stuff. And I feel like that's the kind of stuff I always see posted on comics Twitter, where somebody's like, nobody knows that like Jack Kirby was doing surrealist montage. So like, I think that kind of like, I'm glad that you pointed that out, because I had a feeling I was getting something like slightly anachronistic, just so that Chabon could kind of make this point about like his girlfriend's influence on his art style, and that you could do the stuff with this sort of rigid constraints of like, comic books or whatever.
Yeah. So they've seen Rosa Luxemburg naked.
Yes.
They have sold they've sold The Escapist, and they are writing for oh my god, the name of their boss, Jack Ashkenazi.
That was a little on the nose.
But Chabon did mention again, this is his credit, about how much he knows about early superhero stuff. He mentions Donenfeld, which was the Superman publisher, Harry Donenfeld. And he was the one that was basically, shitting all over Siegel and Schuster. But he mentioned in that like Donenfeld was paying more for certain page lengths or art panel numbers, something like that. I forget what it was, or word counts. And Jack Ashkenazi was like, well, I'm not Donenfeld, take it or leave it.
Yeah.
I feel like they're giving a lot of take it or leave it's over the course of the book.
They really are. Yeah.
That might be important.
Yeah, that might come back. But then, so where do we go next after?
I feel like we got to talk about like the war stuff. I feel like that's really the next. Yeah, that's really the key to what changes. So Joe comes over, and obviously he knows about this Hitler fella, but by the time that like they become very successful. Like relatively speaking, the comics
is like by issue 8 or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Issue 10 specifically.
Yes, and like basically, the publisher is like making a ton of money. Is it Anapol or is it Ashkenazi who like is like building a house in Florida or
I think
something?
I think it's Anapol. Yeah,
Anapol,
Sheldon Anapol.
Because he's like anxious about taking a vacation. Like he's like I bought this house. Like it wasn't a good idea. Like the sort of portrait of him like suddenly encountering success made me laugh the most. Because like later they get a big office and Anapol's like sitting like hunched over in his big office because he feels like oppressed, and so he has to like move back into the broom closet. Yeah, and he's like finally. Like, so
and it's so funny too because he's like nervous about having bought this house, but he's not nervous about nor putting it together that he's talking to his extremely underpaid creatives that whose labor purchased this house for him.
Yeah. And I think that's a thing that I think, like you were saying, John, Chabon identifies, but sort of doesn't do anything with, kind of. Like, it's there, but, like, it's not like there's, like, a movement to, like, seize the means of production, so to speak, you know? So, like, it's identified, but that's kind of all of it, so.
It's not really, like, what the book's about, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, it's definitely there for, like, historical truism, and it kind of, I think, too, again, there's definitely like kind of a tension in this book between like the fantastic and like the mundane. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if they somehow were like able to like get the escapists back and like make a ton of money, like the book suddenly looks very different.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like kind of and we're going to get to that, I think, as we go on, sort of the maybe kind of questionable final message of this book, which is that bourgeois family life is the real adventure.
Jeez. But so at this point, the escape is incredibly violent towards Nazis. Like in the pages, yes, and it is clear that it is the manifestation of Joe's frustration with what's like his not being able to hear news about his family. Or really a lot of news at all about what's going on in Czechoslovakia.
He keeps going to the literal Nazi embassy and being like, can you tell me what's going on with my family? Or can you like help me get my family like over here? Like, can you get them visas? And they're like, maybe.
Yeah, I found the sort of portrayal of bureaucracy in that matter to be like sort of horrifying and kind of like the real villains of this book. It's like, yeah, there are villains historically, but like the villains that the characters encounter is like, yeah, just faceless, uncaring bureaucracy where like Joe's father... But Joe's father dying is like a note falls out of a folder and some breed guy goes like, oh, by the way, your father's dead. Like,
yeah, the whole thing, like, it's so crazy. Like, one of the craziest things to me is just like thinking about all this apparatus functioning in a world without computers. How
does that even work?
Not really the point, but sometimes I'm just like, how did you like manage a visa system before you could like electronically check records?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. So Joe is just beating up German people now.
Yeah, and he's working
yeah.
like 36 hours a day, like basically just channeling all his frustrations into into drawing the escapist punch Nazis. And I feel like there's definitely an implication here that this is part of what's making the book successful, is that there's kind of this and again, maybe this kind of gets into like the boomer-ness of this book a little bit, where it's like, oh, well, America really wants to go fight the Nazis, but we're not being allowed to yet. And so like, oh, he's really sticking into this Hitler guy. I'm going to buy this comic book instead of these boring apolitical comic books.
And like the parallel between the Captain America punching Hitler and the escapist punching Hitler, where like he seems to be like really riffing on that comparison in terms of like what they're doing in this moment in time.
Which is funny because they bring up that Jack Kirby exists in this universe, but they don't mention that cover.
Yeah.
I feel like that's one of those things where like it couldn't have, like it would have, like this in this universe that replaces the Jack Kirby. Captain
the space-time continuum would be just damaged enough if there were two of them. So yeah, it's like one of them replaces the other. So yeah,
there'd be no Hitler left.
If two American comic books had shown their main character punching Hitler, it would have been over.
He'd have just vanished.
Yeah.
But then we get to my favorite scene in the whole book, which is Joe starts radaring in on the tiny piece of shit offices of the American Aryan League.
Yeah.
And just hyper focusing on that. And he, of course, because this book is ridiculous and everybody can just do everything they want and have magical powers, he just breaks a piece of a fence off and files it against the street to make a lockpick. This is 50 years before MacGyver comes out. And he uses it to pick the lock, which of course he knows the exact model of.
During his training, when he was trained,
from his training to into the league, and he gets up there and he finds out that the American Aryan League, at least this one branch, is one member strong. And he's the saddest man in the world.
Yeah, Carl Ebling.
Boy, Carl. But then, and this is so good. And I want a story of this. I want this to be the story, right? Where he finds that the decadence, the Western decadence, if you will, of comic books is a particular bugaboo of this guy. And he's trying to warn the rest of the league, like, this is propaganda that will be effective against us.
Yeah.
But in his correspondence to the league, because he has to diligently read every issue of The Escapist, he becomes a huge fan.
He's a chronicler. Yeah.
I also loved this scene too, Nat. This reminded me of Ben and our episode on Distant Star. This is like the as farce version of them finding all the stuff that the Nazi in that book has like collected. Where it's like, oh, he's got like all this Nazi shit, but also all this like kitsch. And in that book, it's kind of horrifying because it's like, oh yeah, all this stuff is like very like all this like sci-fi and like fantasy stuff is very fascist inflected. But in this book, it's like, oh yeah, like this guy's just an incredible sad sack who really likes
his mom.
Yeah, who loves comic books, but is so mad that they don't like Hitler.
Yeah, cause, like in comparison, in Distant Star, they find like this guy's board games that he designed, and one of them is like a Peruvian ethno-state alternate history, and then like Bolaño just says the press kit said more fun than Monopoly. Like, so like it's just like there's like something kind of like a darkness here that other people aren't perceiving versus this where he's just like, wow, I actually really like The Escapist, even though I'm not supposed to be liking The Escapist for like ideological reasons. So yeah.
You guys, I don't know if you two are gentlemen of culture at all. Do you play Dungeons and Dragons?
My tastes in role-playing games skew a little more exotic than Dungeons and Dragons. I'm a big World of Darkness fan because I see. I wanted to be goth when I was 13.
Well, I was just reading not to tip my hands too much into how much of a big fucking nerd I am, but I was just reading the Grand History of the Realms from like 2006, right? And in the introduction to it, The guy who put it together talks that I'm getting ahead of myself. The guy who talks about wanting to put the book together, in his introduction, he mentions that this is 2006, and it's a few years. He's talking about a few years prior to this. He was on some Wizards of the Coast internet forum, and he was just trawling to see if there was any like complaints or something they could address or whatever. So he says, and he finds all of these references to this one guy's like chronicle of every Dungeons and Dragons timeline from any published book in the game or in the fantasy world, right? And he's, weaponized his particular special interest into putting all of this together. And like, this guy's like, we have to give this man a job. In a better world, that's Carl Ebling and his relationship to the escapist.
Yeah.
I do feel like there is something interesting, and I feel like we haven't mentioned this with the escapist. So the escapist is kind of this Aryan-ish character. Like, he's described as like, he's huge and muscular
and blonde,
super blonde.
Right? Yeah.
I don't know if they mention his eye color, but I think we can assume. And so there is kind of this tension. And again, it kind of goes back to the what you were saying about kind of Sammy looking at Yosef and kind of idealizing him. There's kind of this element where the escapist is kind of, it is kind of this tension with the superheroic. And I feel like this is something you've talked about on your show before, Nat, kind of this way where the fantasy of the superhero is, it's not fascist necessarily, but it's very easy for fascists to get into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's smart that Chabon puts Ebling in here, because he's like the dark fan. Because everyone else in this is just kind of like fans of stuff, but this guy actually has like curdled resentment. And I guess Yosef kind of has that, but he's like the hero. But like the idea that he's like, here's kind of like a dark side of fandom in Carl Ebling that to me balances out the book in terms of like, people that are into stuff. Also, I feel like with the escapist being blonde, like Sammy Clayman dates a blonde guy. So like in one way, the comic book influences his life. But then the fighting that Joseph is drawing in some ways influences his behavior to actually seek out fights with German Americans. And that's something that I think like Chabon doesn't go like, oh, it totally influences your behavior. But it is like suggesting these two characters to do certain things in a way that I think is not like, ignorable, I guess. So.
Well, I think that's kind of the Freudian thing where it's like they're subconsciously... Like, Sammy is subconsciously attracted to blonde men. Yosef's aggression towards Germans is maybe a little less subconscious. But
he understands it very well.
It's covering for like a different need, which is like he wants to know what's going on with his family, and the literal Nazi embassy is not helping him with that. So he's channeling that elsewhere. And Ebling is like this pathetic, fascist man baby who is channeling like his resentment of comic books into this kind of delusion. Eventually, like we eventually see, like he becomes, or he tries to become a supervillain more or less.
Yes. So and in that, like, I submit to you, following the logic that we have already established in this show, right? If there can only be one cover of a superhero punching out Hitler in this universe, right? Then there can only be one of something else, right? Because Carl Ebling exists in this universe, I think John Lennon must still be alive because he's taken the place of Mark David Chapman.
He's tried to do a hit on the person. So
on the person whose work he really likes.
As much as it would pain me to say it, yes, John Lennon is still alive in this universe and presumably making the worst music you have ever heard.
Oh my God. In the Chabon cinematic universe.
We got many John Lennon retirement albums. So
he's also on the cover of the AARP magazine with Bob Dylan.
Oh God. I don't want to live in this world.
But so I think at this point they're really popular. Oh, we forgot to mention that Carl Ebling catches him in the act.
Yes, and
of destroying his office.
Like beats him up
knocks him out. He like swings him against like a wall and he like hits his head on something. Yeah, like
and doesn't he like leaves and says like, my name's like Tom Mayfair, which is like the escapist secret identity, right?
Yeah, and he leaves a drawing of the a sketch that he does of the escapist, like on the back of an envelope or something, or like the file folder about the escapist, which leads us to the first consequence of this, because there are two more run-ins with Ebling, well, 2.5, but that's when we get to okay. So I've just been reading The Power Broker, right, about Bob Moses, right?
Yeah.
So you can imagine my like surprise to find fucking Al Smith in this book. The governor of New York, Al Smith, the cigar chomping, whiskey swilling giant of a man.
Yeah, I had to flip back in that chapter because I was like, wait, is this that Al Smith?
And the Empire State Building has just been evacuated because of a bomb threat made. We don't know whom yet, but of course only one person is in the building, and he has chained himself to the desk using stolen handcuffs he got off a cop using the sleight of hand training that he received in Prague as he was stealing the golem from there so the Nazis couldn't get it. And his name is Joseph Cavalier.
And I also love how everyone is impressed with him. They're like, who is this serious man?
I was reading a write-up of, the awful comic book writer Rob Liefeld, and about how his initial comic book stuff read as like total fan wink self-insert, and somebody described it's as if your friend had handed you a short story fan fiction piece of the X-Files where Mulder and Scully just hang out with their new best friend, your friend. And that's how this book feels, where like Chabon is just like, oh yeah, everybody here is great. But they've got demons because this is literature, right? Yeah. But they could all just do everything they can imagine to get themselves out of any corner.
That also parts of this book not as bad as Forrest Gump, but they trend toward the kind of like this character is doing the only thing they know how, and then they intersect with like world historical characters like Al Smith.
Gumpian.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and so like Joseph is acting clearly in accordance with the story thus far. It's just a little too good to be true with this particular like interaction. It's like and
he just impresses himself upon Al Smith.
Yeah, it was just like it's like this greatest generation, like, oh my god, he's such a professional. Like I gotta hand to the kid, he's a hard worker.
And this is also paired with them getting like picked up to do a radio show, right?
Because James Love is there, the fucking like wool magnate.
The Titans of New York are there to witness this bomb threat. So
I mean, I agree with you guys a little bit in terms of like the Gumpianness, but I feel like part of it is that he's trying to move us through all these different strains of this story. I mean, it's fiction, at a certain point, it's like, okay, fine. There's contrivances, there's plot convenience, because we need to get these various like ducks in a row for these next things to happen.
Yeah.
In particular with this scene, because this scene is actually very key because it leads to basically the rest of the book. I mean, this is where they get picked up for the radio show, which is how Sammy finds out, spoiler alert, he's gay.
But listen, so this is Chabon at his most Chabonic, right?
Yes.
So like instead of the normal course of events of how this would go, where someone who likes making money by purchasing things that other people have worked on sees this incredibly successful creative endeavor and is like, let's put it on the radio. Instead of that logical sequence of events, the artist for this comic book breaks into the office of one of the only Nazis in New York to have an organization that's not the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
Gets caught in the act, knocks the man out, draws a picture of this man's new favorite character as like a kiss goodbye. And then this man calls in a fake bomb threat And in
To the
doing
Empire State
so,
Building.
on the Empire State Building, which is owned by, or which board of directors is run by the former governor of New York, Al Smith, whose best friend happens to be a textile magnate who's there that morning.
Yeah.
And then they
Not
meet
just
each
a
other
textile
that
magnate,
way.
a textile magnate who's a goddamn FDR Democrat.
That's right. That's right. A new dealer who sees his strain of anti-fascism doesn't extend to having unions in his offices, but he still doesn't like that Hitler fella. But on top of all of that, and this is what I mean when I say we could have done away with so much of this book and still gotten a much tighter, more palatable experience, right? He gave himself such a good way to end that scene. And it was when they find out that the bomb is fake. Yeah. And that he's just painted 2 tubes from paper towel rolls red and like rubber banded them to a clock. And then they say, oh, but TNT's not, like dynamite's not even red. And Joe says, guess the guy read too many comic books.
Yeah, it should just ended
That's
there.
Such a good button on a scene.
Yeah.
But there's like 40 more pages of like Al Smith talking to James Love. And then be like, hey, let's give these kids a radio show.
All right, you got me. You got me.
Yeah.
That right there, it's so the essence of this book distilled.
Yeah. No, you're not wrong.
I also feel like that, like a lot of I feel like Chabon tended to use more dialogue in what we've read, and the dialogue in this book is like really punchy like that. Like you could have cut, like many scenes would just have like maybe 1-2 punch dialogue scene, and then like he could have just been in and out real quick, but he needed to work in some sort of like history time themes kind of move the plot along, as John said.
Yeah. And I think too, there's definitely like a vice a lot of people get into when they write historical fiction where they really need to show you all the research they did.
Yeah.
So he needs to show you that he knows about this textile magnate and like his whole deal.
Yeah, the FDR bit is exactly like, I really need to tell you that.
But later that day, we get to the most ridiculous scene in the book.
I was about to say, this is part of why it's important. Yeah. Which is that they end up at a party. And what was
brought to this party by my favorite character, George Deasy.
Yes, George Deasy. I meant to bring him up earlier. So George Deasy is amazing. He's this sad sack pulp writer who works at the magazine at the very start.
Older gentleman.
Yes, but he's definitely the character who kind of, despite himself, takes them like under his wing. And it's great. At some point, they're dickering with like the owner of the magazine. They're like, we want a raise, and we want one for Deasy too. And he's like, no, boys, you can't advocate for me. I'm in management. And I also love that he's presented as having this cynical demeanor that is like his shattered ideals from when his brother married the love of his life, and from the fact that he has to keep writing pulp novels to make a living, and he can't write the great novel that he's been working on for so long unfinished. So he has this sort of like cynical demeanor that he uses to like evaluate other people's work. And then at the very end, we find out that he joined the CIA. He did a reverse Angleton.
Oh, that's so good. Oh, that's so funny. And to top it all off, this man who absolutely fucking hates his work wears it like a bedazzled hair shirt because he self-publishes a leather-bound collection of all of his pulp works and doesn't sell it. He just keeps it for his own personal collection.
just to be this just horrible reminder.
It's like, go ahead,
crucially,
John.
He's still like very up and up with like all the New York like muckety muck art people, which is how they end up at the coolest party that was probably happening in 1941.
This scene, I swear.
Yeah, the surrealist party at like a really cool fat art dealer guy's house, like Harku or something. Like
a Longman Harku, and it turns out to be Rosa Luxemburg Sachs's dad.
Yes, who's this amazing guy? He wears like robes all the time, and like caftans,
and asks everybody to take the exact same picture of himself, and swears that they all look different because the photographer's spirit comes through. But one of the best parts is, and he briefly touches on this, is that every single thing in this house is at 3/4 size normal versions of it. So you feel like a giant in this tiny mansion.
I was getting flashbacks to the story from the latest season of Blowback where they talk about like the Cambodian general who like made everything smaller in his office to make himself look bigger.
Oh, that's really good. I haven't listened to that one yet. I've heard it's great.
Quite good. But yeah, that just as someone who is in the art world, like, this might have been like something that lodged itself subconsciously in my head. I was like, oh, I want to go to like a party like this. And then I went to one of those parties for real and it sucked. Because it's just people networking.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, and like it's described as like all of these different like types of people are just all like crashing into each other, and like Chabon has all of these like descriptors of the different kinds of surrealists who are there, and like the different kinds of like weird conversations that are happening, and like both of the boys are like sort of adrift at first, like they don't know who to talk to, and they're like overwhelmed.
Until
the centerpiece, of the whole thing.
Until in another Gumpian turn.
In the living room,
Salvador Dali walks in a diving suit. And
he's in a breathing apparatus that he's set up, like a sleeping thing where he can set up in like so he can sleep underwater in this house in New York, right?
And yeah, of course, like a screw's gotten too tight, and so he starts suffocating to death.
Yeah, because it twists the metal, and the water starts to come into the helmet, or something breaks, a seal breaks, and the water starts to fill up in the helmet, right?
Yeah, and the character says, "Help! He's drowning." Yeah,
on dry land.
Yeah, on dry land. Crucially, yeah. So.
And luckily, they have the one person in all of New York City who's been trained as a stage magician.
And of course, this is right after he's just had a conversation with the long lost manic pixie dream girl who he saw in somebody's bed naked 6 months ago and has never forgotten. And this is right after he's been in conversation with her where she's flirting with him, not remembering who he was. And then she gets this look on her face like, uh-oh, I know who you are. And then Salvador Dali starts drowning.
Yeah, and he's able to quick thinkingly like use a knife to unloosen one of the screws, I think, and thus save Dali from drowning on dry land. So
right.
And in doing
dislocating his finger in the process, which I thought would have more I thought it would do anything to the story. It does not.
No.
I think it's just an excuse to get him and Rosa alone so Rosa can fix his finger.
Yeah.
And so then they can have a somewhat intimate scene. So, yeah.
And also it's so Joseph can be exposed to the beautiful world of surrealist art, which, there was none of that in Prague in the 1930s. But there is a great bit at that party where, this is like at the height of Joe, like going out and just fighting random Germans. And apparently like he hears like a guy like speaking in like a German accent or like speaking German, like he almost gets in a fight with him. And then at some point, someone later is like, that's Max Ernst.
Yeah, I love that the narrator says that of the book, the another chronicler who's like, it's good that he didn't fight Max Ernst, who actually like hated the Nazis or something. Like, yeah.
And I think crucial to the relationship between Joe and Rosa is that it's because of her influence that he saves himself from himself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And
saved by the love of a good woman.
Which is funny because she's going to be the one that basically domesticates him to suburban life later.
Yes.
Yeah. So like the thing about Rose's character is like John and I have tracked that like Chabon really likes the manic pixie dream girl type for his female characters, and like she is an impact on his his art style. There's a great line where he is describing to her that I marked this because I thought in some way this is about the book. Her bedroom has a bunch of moths. I just want to say that I'm not making this up. So as the sentence goes, sitting on Rose's moth-littered bed, he felt a resurgence of all the aches and inspirations of those days when his life had revolved around nothing but capital A art. When snow fell like the opening piano notes of the Emperor Concerto, and feeling horny reminded him of a passage from Nietzsche, and a thick red-streaked dollop of crimson paint in an otherwise uninteresting Velasquez made him hungry for a piece of rare meat. And I was like, yeah, he's saved from it by himself. He discovers his love of art. And I think that sort of sentence also kind of stands for the book, because the book loves art if it's comic books and magician tricks and pulp writing. And so, yeah, he's sort of saved from himself by this manic pixie dream girl. Although, as I think later, she also sort of becomes less manic pixie dream girl. And yeah, Joe kind of gets a domestic bourgeoisie family life.
Yeah. She becomes a workhorse.
Yeah.
So I have just on a kind of a comedy note. Imagine boys, imagine you go up to a girl you've been flirting with the room and it's full of moths. I would run out of the room. I would be that's nasty.
You're looking at her like you've never seen surrealist art before, and you're looking at it, and then you step on 10 moths and that are on the ground.
And she's like, I want to show you my dream book, and I'd be like, I need to leave.
It reeks of moth in here.
Yeah.
Well, it's so because clearly they're a very well-off family.
Yeah,
it's just
with a mansion in Manhattan.
Bugs.
It's not really explained. I'm sure it is. I just can't remember. It just feels like one of those, one thing we haven't talked about is Chabon being kind of a new sincerity writer. And I associate this kind of manic invention with that, where it's I can't really just say that she was an interesting girl. I have to show it to you 8 times in increasingly ludicrous ways. So,
well, again, they're another Tenenbaum family, which I don't know. Yeah. I maybe have less patience for in literature because you can use interiority to describe people.
Yeah. One of the things that always sets my hair on end is when writers or any time in media, we are forced to sit through 2 cool, interesting people talk about music that is real, music from real life. And they always recognize the same artists, they know the same artists, oh yeah, this is great. And it's just somebody showing off that they know about music.
Yeah, yeah.
It's always what it is. I forget the Trout Concerto or whatever. She puts it on.
Oh, yeah, Schubert.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's oh, great. That took a lot of time.
I too love Schubert. Yeah.
Schubert is actually genuinely one of my favorite. Schumann, Schubert, and Brahms. They're some of my 3 favorites, right? But I don't give a shit about listening to people who aren't real talk about them.
Yeah, especially too after there's that weird collection of objects bravura paragraph. It's that should have just been enough, really. It's just that paragraph, but instead they have to talk about Schubert and then so
But I thought they were gonna have the okay, so I guess this is a good time for me to just talk about what I expected from this book. As soon as the radio stuff came in, I was like, oh, it's going to shove us into the 70s about 3/4 of the way through the book. And we're going to have to see their struggles with their analog of Superman, the movie.
Yeah.
The Reeve stuff, right? Mm-hmm. I really thought we were going to get birth to death, the Bildungsroman sort of thing.
Yeah.
Right. Which we don't really.
No.
We get half of that. I guess it still technically counts as a Bildungsroman. I don't know. But I really thought we were going to get that, and I was really excited for that. But one of the things I thought was going to manifest itself was that out of joint finger, because part of the Schuster story is that he really pretty rapidly lost his eyesight.
Oh, whoa.
And the ability to draw once he got to a certain age. And so I thought that was going to parallel with that Joe would have to somehow work around this finger that grows arthritic in his age because of this one particular, because he saved Salvador Dali from drowning in a living room.
Yeah.
Nat, that has me thinking, because I also like I read this book, like I said, like a long time ago, but I'd kind of forgotten most of it. And I remembered this book like going further into the future, because I remember like it starts in like present day at the convention, and then it's like, oh, it goes like all the way through. Like it was much more of like a history of comic books, like through the different periods. And I really am guessing that there is maybe not like a full draft that goes further through their lives, but I am sure that like when he was thinking through this story, that there was probably more there. And then at some point he had to be like, I have to find a way to cut this off.
I have to finish
point.
this book.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like
yeah.
World War II gets like way more central to this book, because it gives him kind of a convenient way to cut things off and then tie them back together neatly at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also, did your guys' book have the extra stuff at the end, like the bonus features?
Yes, but I didn't read it.
I didn't
Okay, because I read, so one of them was written as like a "Where Are They Now" parody of like a New York Times article.
Oh.
And like he ties off some of their arcs at the end there, where like similar to the finger thing, Joseph just dies of cancer, presumably from smoking too much. And then like Sammy Clayman is still alive, and he's sort of like the cantankerous old man at the Comic-Con who's like telling stories. And he does travel with Rosa as the sort of like working duo talking about the good old days, and it sort of like ends there. I thought it was weird that he decided to have Joseph die of cancer as something like, yeah, he smoked too much and like we need to have one of these characters die of smoking or something. But like, but it's written at the end, and like it felt kind of perfunctory in a way that like he could have maybe had some interesting commentary on like, yeah, like how the comic scene shifted. But instead, they're just kind of like the two old people at the Comic-Con who have like seen earlier times, kind of. So
I hate that, actually.
Yeah, I was about to say, how unceremonious.
That also like kind of undoes the whole thing at the end, which I also don't like.
Yeah.
But the whole thing at the end is like, oh, there's a parting and then coming back together.
yeah.
And it's like, oh, that also like comes apart, and then a different thing comes back together. That happens to be the same thing from the, and we'll get to it.
Yeah, we're so early in the book still.
Yeah, let's
and it's an hour and a half into this.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitellibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.